Okay, everyone got a copy of the Elements of a Story handout today in class. I also put a hard copy in the class folders on Edmodo so that if you want to type directly into it, you can, and have those notes for you. You are also required, like you did with the Wordly Wise, to have note cards for the literary devices. Everything on this worksheet is considered a literary device. Essentially, you're going to be turning in 57 note cards to me. If you're looking at the worksheet just as a reference, resolution and denouement under the plot section can go on the same note card. And then under the characterization section, showing versus telling or indirect versus direct, each need to go on separate note cards. Other than that, every single bullet point should have its own note card. If you do the math on that, it's 57 note cards, and these note cards will be due the day of the quiz, which will happen early next week. Okay, so the note cards here, again, front and back, it'll look very similar to the style that is used for the vocabulary. Again, first and last name go up in the upper left-hand corner. On the front blank side go the name of the literary device. And on the back goes the definition. The definitions can be found in your textbook. I actually gave page numbers. I want you to use the book's definitions, not the internet's definitions. The reason I say this is because sometimes the internet is wrong and sometimes they skew the definition differently than what we're actually learning in class. And then the example, I want you to write your own example. And I want you to actually I don't want you to give me just one or two words. I want you to actually explain the example. So when we get to the characters, don't just give me the name of a character, but tell me how a character actually fits in to that. Okay, so you'll recognize the PowerPoint. It's one that we have already have started on in class, but I've left off on specifically this idea of what pertains to the elements of a story. So these ones I'll be doing in lecture in the video for the next 2 days. Okay, the plot aspect, so looking at the first section of the elements of a story, the plot refers to the series of events or actions that take place in a story, and it usually goes in chronological order, and it has 5 main parts. So we have in green here, we have the exposition. The exposition usually includes the introduction of the characters, the setting, the main part of the conflict, usually, or the introduction of a conflict, usually some historical context and background, but it's that idea of that introduction to a story. Then we have rising action, shown here in the orange. Rising action is taking that conflict that happens right at the end of the exposition, or that inciting incident, and it builds on it. It moves up along the story. So it's events that are building to a climax. Now the climax is that highest point of action within a story, and it's usually a predictor on how the rest of the story is going to end, so that you know what's taking place and what's happening. And this leads to the purple, or the falling action. This is the starting to wrap the events up and bringing it to that close. Usually most of the story is spent on the rising action, and less of the story usually comes after the climax. In showing that idea of the authors don't usually need much time to wrap up the story itself. Now the resolution, or what is also known as the denouement, which is French for unknotting, is that idea of wrapping the story in a nice neat little bow and showing that it's done. So the conflict that was introduced here is actually gone through the whole cycle and it's resolved. It's unknotted, it's untangled, and taken apart, so it's nice and neat and pretty and perfect. Okay, there are other aspects of plot on the elements of a story that are not here in the basic plot diagram. It's your responsibility to look those up and pay attention to those, because they are important, especially in media res, flashback, and setting, and how they apply to the story itself. Okay, so looking at character types and look at this idea of characterization. Now, this is a little mixed within the plot area and the characterization area if you're looking at your elements of a story. There are 8 specific ones that we're going to look at, and they kind of go in pairs with this idea of what's important and together. So we have protagonist and we have antagonist. We all know, and it's a vocabulary word this week, protagonist, that it's the main character of the story. And it could be positive character, it could be a negative character. Last year when we read A Streetcar Named Desire, Blanche was our protagonist and Stanley was our antagonist, but she was a weird protagonist because pro usually meaning that positive aspect, but in the case of the definition, protagonist is the main character. The antagonist is the person in conflict with the main character. So you could have an evil protagonist and a good antagonist, but that's usually not the case. Usually you have a good protagonist and an evil antagonist. Now, the elements here that we started to talk about from the lecture earlier this week or last week on characters. And we saw this in How to Read Literature Like a Professor, especially this idea of like round and flat characters and stock characters. So we have these aspects, and I don't know why I have them out of order, but dynamic and static go together. So dynamic is this character that starts out one way, and you see a progression through the character. You see the character change, you see them grow. Usually your dynamic characters have like that epiphanal moment. They're usually your protagonist and they go in that cycle of that conflict, causing them to grow in some action. Now your static character is a character that is flat, that stays the same. So they have very few personality aspects, but they have whatever happens to them at the beginning of the story, they stay the same throughout it. So they stay static through it, and you hear the same noise and the same voice and same monotony from that character. Now, round characters, like we talked about, are ones that you know multiple aspects of. So you know not only their physical looks and the characteristics, but you also know their personality, their interests, their likes, their how they do this and how they do that aspect. So they're a full rounded character that you get a complete picture of. Whereas a flat character, you only know 1 or 2 personality aspects. You're probably going to know physical aspects, but you usually only know 1 or 2 personality aspects, so they're flat. They're not rounded. They're more like a 2-dimensional character versus a round character, which is more 3-dimensional and very life and robust. Now, a dynamic character is usually round, and a static character is usually flat. Okay, round characters are going to be your main aspects of your characters, not your secondary. So if you're looking at Death of a Salesman, this is going to be the 4 main characters. Willie, Biff, and Linda, and Happy. Okay. Now, not all of them actually stay, not all of them have this dynamic aspect. Some of them are static. Happy could be considered a flat character. You could easily argue for that. Now, stock, these are your stereotypical characters. Your wicked stepmother, evil character in black, the dumb jock, the blonde cheerleader. These are your normal stereotypical stock characters. The wicked witch, aspects that you know just by putting that character there, that you know what to expect from them. It's like you can pull them off the shelf, put them into the story, and you know just by the basic description what's going to happen with that character. So they're a stock character, one that is dependable for us. The last aspect here we have is foil. A foil character is this idea that you take 2 characters and you put them side by side and they foil each other. So their characteristics placed side by side show the full character itself. So if we look at Biff and Happy, Biff has the buff masculine aspects, and Happy has the more emotional side, the more job side. And if you put these 2 together, they actually foil one another. They show the characteristics of the other side. This can easily be seen in other stories when we look at, if we go all the way back to Romeo and Juliet, and we look at Romeo and his cousin Mercutio. You get Romeo, who's the hot-headed, masculine man who just goes right after his heart, and then you have Mercutio, who's the more closed, more thinking fully of himself, and if you put them two together, you get this rounded, full character. Okay, now looking at this idea of characterization, this goes with the showing versus telling, or the indirect versus direct. So this is through the characterization, we have this creation of a persona of the characters within the dramas, the poetry, the novels, the short stories. We have two different aspects we look at. So we get direct characterization. And remember, direct and indirect, or showing versus telling, need to go on different note cards, okay? So direct characterization. The author directly tells the reader about the quality of a character straight out. This is where we get a lot of physical descriptions and aspects like that. So like an eye color, hair color, energy levels. So an example here. George is hyper and obviously has a great deal of energy. So this shows us as readers directly what George is like. We know exactly what to expect. We know he's hyper and we know he's energetic. Now, indirect means that you have to draw your own conclusions based on information that the author or the character gives you. And there are 5 methods of indirect characterization. Okay, these need to somehow apply within your note card. So we can find out through speech, how you doing, partner? By the author telling us this, we find out the idea of education levels. We found at the level of politeness. What type of character is this? What personal history do we have here? So just by hearing the words "how you doing, partner," you know you're probably talking to a cowboy. You know that personal history in that aspect. You probably expect the person to be wearing a cowboy hat and boots. And you know that they're probably not very educated because they're dropping letters like the G on doing. So that's how we fit indirectly into speech. So it's not right in our face. Appearance. So his tattered clothes were torn and filthy. So just by looking at that, we make assumptions about the character. It doesn't tell us that they're rich or poor. It doesn't tell us that they're directly responsible or lazy. But by looking at this, we can probably make assumptions about the character. That the character's probably poor, that there's the possibility of being lazy, maybe they're homeless, maybe they haven't taken a shower, maybe they're not responsible enough to take a shower. Actions. So looking at this idea through their actions, she waited patiently until it was her turn. She made sure to thank the salesperson when his business was complete. So through her actions, is she polite? Is she thoughtful? Is she, how is she in her actions? So if she patiently waited her turn, we know that she's a polite person. She's thoughtful of others. She's not being manipulative. She's being courteous about the business transaction. The 4th one, in their private thoughts. So this is like if we look at Willie from Death of a Salesman, what's going on in his flashbacks and in his private thoughts. As he stood in line, he thought to himself, this cashier is incompetent and needs to be fired. So by looking at this, we know that this person probably has some anger issues. They probably are quick to make judgments. They're probably unrealistic or demanding, or they could just be having a bad day, but it's looking at that interpersonal aspect. So the next thing we have is this idea of other responses to character, or to the character. So how other people view that character. When he walked into the room, everyone rolled their eyes and tried to scatter. So if someone walks into a room and there's that reaction, us as an audience knows that the character that just walked in is probably not respected. People hate them. He don't get along with people. And something's happened to get people to hate this person. Okay, so that's indirect versus direct, or showing versus telling. Direct is showing, indirect is telling. Okay, that's it for your slides for tonight. I'll finish the rest of them in tomorrow night's video. Have a good night, start on your note cards, and I will see you in class tomorrow.